From the Commonwealth Club of California, this is Climate One, changing the conversation about America's energy, economy, and environment. I'm Greg Dalton, and on the show today, we will plunge into the information war raging in our country on social media and in the mainstream news media. Fake news manufactured in Europe helped catapult Donald Trump into the White House. And since his inauguration, the news media has been struggling with how to handle statements from the president and his lieutenants. Is Donald Trump a climate denier? What is a lie? What is factual? And what is an alternative fact? Liberals are focused on facts and decry the post-fact world. Conservatives pay more attention to values and narratives, which are more likely to be remembered by the human brain. The reality is, facts are important, but they may not be as important as you think they are. Facts often don't change hearts and minds. Joining our live audience at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, we're pleased to have with us two distinguished language and journalism experts. George Lakoff is a linguist at the University of California, Berkeley, where he studies how human brains process language and ideas. He is the author of numerous popular books, including The Political Mind: Why You Can't Understand 21st Century American Politics with an 18th Century Brain, and Don't Even Think of an Elephant: Know Your Values and Frame the Debate. Robert Rosenthal is executive director of the Center For Investigative Reporting, which produces the Reveal radio show and other award-winning journalism. He previously was the managing editor of the San Francisco Chronicle and editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. He was also an editorial assistant at the New York Times on the Pulitzer Prize-winning Pentagon Papers Project. Please welcome them to Climate One. So George Lakoff, we'll get into the factual part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain, and they're connected. But first I want to go to a story in an emotional place with you. Where were you on election night 2016, and how did you feel?
Well, we were having some tacos, and I felt pretty bad after a while. And it wasn't just the tacos. But what's strange is in March 2016, I wrote a paper called Understanding Trump, which predicted that he would get 47% of the vote, and told exactly why and what he did, how he worked, and why he was very smart and why he used other people's brains to his advantage. And he only got 46% of the vote, but certain percentages were taken away by other candidates. And of course, the Democrats did everything they could to get him elected. So we can talk about that.
We will talk about that in the way that you'll say, for example, that Hillary Clinton put Trump in the middle of her campaigns. Robert Rosenthal, another emotional day. I want to ask you about Inauguration Day. Where were you and how did you feel?
I don't remember. I actually, I have a cold, so excuse me. I was, by that time, I think I wasn't surprised he won, but I was listening to his words, and I found them the dark side of America that I don't really see, and I was sorry that he didn't have a different message, and for the country and for the whole world, really.
We're gonna. We invited Kelly, I want to get to the part for Gary. We invited a pollster, Republican pollster, to join the program today from Denver, who works for John McCain and other national figures. She couldn't make the trip to San Francisco. We look forward to hearing from her another day. We did want to hear from a Trump voter, so we sent one of our producers to talk with one, something few people in blue states and cities do these days, although there are more Trump voters in San Francisco than you might think. Nearly 10% of voters, 37,000 people in the bluest city in the bluest state, went for Trump. So let's hear from Gary Malaysian and hear what he has to say about Donald Trump.
My name is Gary E. Malaysian. I started out in Fresno. I went to UC Davis. I took my doctorate there in plant physiology. I turned my back on that because the politics in academia, the American people have too much time, too much money, and too much freedom. and they don't know what to do with those things, and San Francisco is the capital of that. The whiniest groups, if you read the Chronicle, are gays, blacks, and women. And you can never do enough for any one of those groups. They always want more. The game plan in San Francisco is to kill and destroy Donald Trump. The guy hasn't even been in office. He hasn't put his people together yet. And they're criticizing, condemning, and complaining. These folks are dropping beneath the Tea Party. They're doing the exact same thing that they accused the Tea Party of doing. That's not the high road. I was going to vote for Bernie because I think he had the message that he gave, but he was up against a snake. America's biggest failing is supporting single women to have babies that they cannot afford. That brings the whole culture down. I mean, I grew up in a family that disciplined their children. The problem with women that having babies without a father, there's no discipline. It's all enabling. Fundamentally, in my head, women are nurturers, and God bless them. We need nurturing. Men are pioneers. Mankind should learn to live together in peace and harmony and not combat each other. And I think that's where Mr. Trump is headed. I give me hope because I have a belief system that I haven't had to change my whole life. That gives me hope.
Trump voter Gary Malaysian, who's in the House tonight. George Lakoff, a lot there, nurturing mothers, yet Hillary Clinton was a snake, a lot there. How do you analyze that?
Well, I wrote a book called Moral Politics a little over 20 years ago, which came about by asking, why do certain positions fit together? You know, conservatives are say we're going to get rid of abortions, but we're going to have a flat tax. What does taxation have to do with abortion? We're going to get rid of environmental regulations. What does that have to do with those? Everybody should be able to own a gun. What does that have to do with any of the others? And on and on. And I figured it out, finally, when I realized one of my students had written a paper that we all have a metaphor of the nation as a family. We have founding fathers, we send our sons and daughters to war, we have homeland security, and nobody says, what do you mean fathers? I mean, we have founding fathers, the nation as a family. The question is, what kind of family? And what we found was that there are two types of families, a strict father family and a nurturing parent family, which corresponds to, metaphorically to progressive and conservative thought, but they're not just that way. There are some people who are only one and only the other, but many people who are, what is a moderate? A moderate is somebody who is mostly one and partly the other in various ways. And then conservatives, which we'll get into in a minute, have what is called in-group nurturance. If you're in a conservative church, they'll take care of people who are needy, who are church members. If you're in a military unit, you take care of the people in that military unit, and the military takes care of its own. If a lot of people who are conservative, and I was brought up among them, have in-groups that they care about. They might be their family, their neighbors, their community, the people who they go bowling with, or whoever. And I think it's important that that's the case because they really do take care of them. You know, you'll find when there is a fire threatening the neighbors' homes, there are these conservative guys out there, manning the fire hoses. If there's a flood, they'll be throwing the sandbags. They do care about their community seriously because it's their in-group. And that's part of conservatism. Now, there are conservatives like Trump who don't have that kind of views. He's like total, almost, except for his own family. He does his family as his in-group. But aside from that, that's it. Now, what is a strict father family? And that's the big deal. In a strict father family, the father knows right from wrong, and that gives him authority. He has to impose it. He has to make sure his kids do what he says, not do what feels good. You've heard about feel-good liberalism. It means they don't have a strict enough father. And what he says is that If they don't do what he says, if they, stand up to him or sass him or anything like that, and don't show respect, then he's supposed to punish them. It's called tough love. Because he loves them, he has to punish them. It's his duty. And not only that, the child, if the child tries to avoid the punishment, then they do what he says. And if they do that and don't do what feels good, they get discipline. And if they have discipline, they should be able to go out in the world and be prosperous. So what if they're not prosperous? Means they don't have discipline, therefore they can't be moral, and they deserve their poverty. So, poor people are lazy. And then you have a further part, and this is the big deal. If it's the case that authority and morality go together, then what that says is that if that is a natural thing in the world, the way you find out who is better than who has better morality, is by looking at who won. And so you have things like religion won out, so you have a hierarchy, a moral hierarchy of God above man. You have man above nature. We've conquered nature. Nature is there for you. Take whatever you want of it. Man above nature. You have the rich above the poor. Employers above employees. You have adults above children in 21 states. Teachers and coaches who have children who don't listen to them can beat their kids with sticks. That's a law in 21 states. And you can imagine the states, and you'll be right. The other part of this is you then have Western culture above non-Western culture, because Western culture won out, and you have America above other nations. America first, men above women, whites above non-whites, Christians above non-Christians, straights above gays. That's the moral hierarchy. Take any ultra-right-wing conservative position and you'll find the place in that hierarchy. That hierarchy determines the ultra-right view of the world.
Robert Rosenthal, Brendan Nyhan wrote recently at the New York Times that before the election, fake news was primarily aimed at Trump voters. After the election, research shows that Democrats are more likely to believe conspiracy-minded statements than a month before the election. He wrote that, quote, losing political control can make people more vulnerable to misinformation and conspiracy theories. I'd like to hear your thoughts on fake news and whether how Democrats are just as susceptible, more so now perhaps after the election.
Yeah, well, fake news has always existed. Propaganda, disinformation. I think the difference today is that you have the technology to spread it instantly and through social media. And we tend to think about media and throw all, newspapers, television, but media, excuse me, is really different than journalism. And I think what happened with the conspiracy ideas or theories getting more traction, say from the losers, is because they lost. And they wanted to believe something, and it's an explanation. But, I think the real big issue here is information. And to me, it almost supersedes journalism or media. And it's how information is disseminated and believed and controlled. And we are now in an information civil war because you believe what you want to believe and you don't believe what they believe. And it's, to me, the potential in history for the worst things that come out in terms of autocratic dictatorships, whatever you want to call it, it always goes to the control of the information. And if you're in an information world where the information only comes, which we don't have right now, from the government, obviously that's the worst case scenario. So I think it's really important to understand that, and that's not just journalism or media, it's the way information moves and the way it moves today. And it's accelerated. And the fact is that the president now is the biggest and most influential publisher in the world through Twitter. And I think we all have to also think about that our brains aren't made to process information with the speed we're getting it today. And just think about your own lives or 20 years ago where maybe you had a cell phone and what that device means today in terms of how you get and also receive information.
Robert Rosenthal is the executive director of the Center for Investigative Reporting. George Lakoff, Amanda Taub wrote recently in the New York Times, quote, "Americans' deep bias against the political party they oppose is so strong that it acts as a kind of partisan prism for facts, refracting a different reality to Republicans than to Democrats." And she goes on to say that partisanship is core to our identity now in a way that it didn't used to be in the past.
First of all, it has been in the past to a large extent, but we never noticed it, and it wasn't to this extent. But I think you have to understand something about the brain to understand what's going on here. Every idea is physical. It's in your neural circuitry. You think with your brains. Ideas don't float through the air. Now, what that means is that if you have an ideology, a worldview of any kind, you have lots of complex circuitry, lots of ideas, and they're fixed. They're not going anywhere. Now, you can only understand things that your brain allows you to understand. And that's a major point. So if you have just one worldview, and by the way, I think most people have more than one at once, but if you have only one worldview, what happens when you get information in that does not fit that worldview? It may not be noticed. It may be ignored. It may be changed. You may actively change it, and there's experiments that show that people do change it. It can be ridiculed or attacked.
But do facts change minds?
Do facts change minds? It depends. So in these cases, facts may not change minds. And there's a deep reason for this. Let's suppose you have either a nurturant worldview, progressive worldview or conservative worldview, your very being is defined by that worldview. And especially if you have a strict father worldview, it's very important that your identity, your very identity, is wrapped up in that worldview. That's who you are, because what is important is it defines right and wrong, and you want to think you're right in everything you do. Everybody does. So the result of that is that you have an identity defined by a moral worldview. And what that means is anything entailed by that worldview has to be truth. Your worldview must be a higher truth. And anything that follows from it is, and if it isn't a fact, if it isn't out there and independent of the worldview, that becomes an alternative fact. The alternative facts are those things that follow from that part of the worldview that is unchangeable, that defines who you are, and that there's no alternative to. Now, many people are partly progressive and partly conservative, and we'll go there in a while. But I think the main thing is that the idea of an alternative fact relative to Trump, who has, I think, virtually just a strict father worldview, with the exception of maybe his family, that's it. I mean, and what happens is, if you have that worldview, then certain things must be facts, or else your whole identity goes. And that's, I think, true of a lot of Trump supporters, of the strong Trump supporters, who will take lies. Suppose there are facts out there and they're told lies. Well, the lies are not as important as the truth that defines who they are. They're not as important as the truth that defines who they are. And that is very important. That's why you can say, oh, he's a liar, and a liar, and it won't matter.
Robert Rosenthal, there's been quite a bit of discussion in journalism, when to call a lie a lie. How are you handling that, and all these shades of lies and mistruths, false statements?
Well, we're not producing content every day, and I think, investigative reporting is deeply fact-based. It's based on documents, it's on the record sources, and everything we do goes through a tremendous legal vetting, because we get sued and we get, prior to publication, very often threats, either from corporations, individuals, through attorneys. So we really believe we're fact-based. But I think if I was running the newspaper like I once did, I think you'd have to call it out. But I also think that this question of facts, they don't matter if your belief system doesn't accept them, because your emotion, your belief system, And you go back to, again, whole societies that were moved not by facts, but by information, propaganda that the masses went along with. And if you stood up to the facts, you were punished, and you were an outsider, you were excluded. I think that in the country today, we are split, obviously, and there's probably a bigger, I'll call it the middle, or a movable middle, who might react to facts, who are also quite emotional and driven by their emotions, but want to believe sort of the best thing or the better things. And also, the framework of what American democracy means and what American culture is and the uniqueness of American society as it's evolved is something that I think a lot of people hold on to. I also think that right now the conversation, if people are going to come together again, there are places where values will be met. George mentioned, in the military, I'm not sure it's a conservative value, but I would call it more of a team value. You have a common purpose, you have a goal, you're under threat, you're coming together no matter who you are, what your politics are, and that's some of the strongest bonding you can have. That happens in sports, it happens in the right environment, in a business or in a university. When you have a common goal, you share. We're fractured right now. And the other thing I think that's really complicated, that's different today also, especially with the speed of information and the ability to watch things, people are confused about what is opinion and what's journalism or facts. And the way the business models for Fox or MSNBC and others have evolved is about being totally counter, and having a pure political point of view and agenda. And people who watch that, I remember watching something the BBC did recently where they interviewed a bunch of Trump supporters in Arkansas, and one woman was sticking to something which was completely not true, and the person interviewing said, "Here are all the facts." She said, "But I read it on the internet." That's God's word. So again, people believe the sources they want to believe, and that's really something that I don't think any of us have an answer to in this divided, fractured civil war we're in.
President Donald Trump held a press conference to announce his new nominee for Secretary of Labor, and it quickly morphed into an all-out attack on the press. Let's take a listen.
Unfortunately, much of the media in Washington, D.C., along with New York, Los Angeles in particular, speaks not for the people, but for the special interests and for those profiting off a very, very obviously broken system. The press has become so dishonest that if we don't talk about it, we are doing a tremendous disservice to the American people. Tremendous disservice. We have to talk about it to find out what's going on, because the press honestly is out of control. The level of dishonesty is out of control.
Robert Rosenthal, you and your profession out of control?
No, I think when President Trump the other day said, the enemy, the American media is the enemy of the American people. This is, out of the playbook of the worst leaders in the history of the world. And it's extremely dangerous. And there, I worked on something a few years ago where Chauncey Bailey, who was an African-American journalist, was assassinated, in the streets of Oakland when he went to work one day. And I was part of a team of people who actually did stories that led to the killers are now in jail. So journalists, law enforcement, the military, journalists are maybe one of the other professions in the world where they're targeted and killed and put in jail and silenced because of their work. And obviously this country and the founding fathers understood the role of a free press. So I find that personally appalling, and as a journalist, really threatening, and it's going to lead to things, there are consequences for words and information. And I think, that's something, whatever your politics are, it's really something to think about in terms of what this country is based on. And I think one of the things about the press, every president sees the press as part of the opposition. It's the nature of our society. So when it's not as if the press is focused on Trump, he's certainly given us a lot of grist. But Obama actually was one of the most harshest in terms of the press, and following up on whistleblowers to try and get their sources more than any president in the history of the country combined. So it's not necessarily a Democratic or a Republican issue. It's really about the issues and values I mentioned earlier of what American democracy is based on.
George Lakoff, yeah, making the enemy, calling the press the enemy of the state, or enemy of the people.
Look, the press did something really dumb after that happened. They came out with a Twitter feed, not the enemy of the people, right? It's like, you know, Nixon said, "I am not a crook." Everybody thought he was a crook. I wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant. What would you think of? An elephant. You know, not the enemy. You're going to think of them as the enemy. You know, I came out the next day and I wrote a piece, again, the Twitter feed of Protect the Truth, and explained why that was. And the reason is very simple. In order to negate something, you have to activate in your brain what is being negated, right? And every time you activate something in your brain, it becomes stronger. So the more you negate something, the stronger it gets. And you find lots of progressive TV shows and so on where they will constantly take some outrageous thing said on Fox News, and then they'll negate it. And they'll repeat it and negate it and repeat it and negate it, thus helping the other side all the time.
Yeah, I just want to follow up. I agree, but I think that was an incredibly shrewd thing he said, actually, because whatever the follow-up was on, we're not the enemy. But what he's really doing is laying the groundwork, and it will happen over and over and over again, for that whatever is critical of him is not to be believed. Exactly. And it's your enemy. It's not my enemy. It's your enemy. So this information, this story, so going forward, and I think there will be a lot more coming that was critical, he's going to remind people, don't believe it, don't believe it, don't believe it. They are the enemy. They lie. So that's going to be the constant refrain. It's the messaging also. It's not just the one statement. It'll be a continual theme going forward. And for the people who think the press is the enemy, anything that's critical of Trump will be coming from the enemy. Who are your enemies? Who are your enemies? What do you do to your enemies?
And when he says the people, he means the people who follow him. So, you know, and you got that with Pence talking to the NATO leaders who said, oh, the American people want NATO to have a bigger military. It's the American people, right? It's not the American people, it's Trump. And he stands for the people who are following him. That's an important distinction. There's another very important thing about information. When Lincoln talked about a government of, by, and for the people, if a government is of the people, there is no line between the government and the people, and no informational line. You have information should flow in both ways. What has happened now is we now have a gag rule on the government. That is, things like the EPA and the Food and Drug Administration and so on are not allowed to tell their results to the people, and they don't take information from it, and they don't pay any attention to it. What that does is get rid of the notion of a government of the people. That truth is part of democracy. It's part of democracy and we never really noticed it before. We thought elections would just give us that and it'd be okay. Now we notice that the of, by, and for the people is really very important. By the people. The people are not billionaires. We have government by billionaires now. What about for the people? That has to do with caring. You know, this government was set up originally by citizens who cared about other people, worked through the government to provide public resources for everybody, whether they're in business or private life. All those resources, whether they're roads and bridges or airports or scientific research, et cetera, is for everybody, whether you're in business and so on. And you can't have either private life or private enterprise without that. Now, that whole idea of public resources is being turned on its head. The Republicans want to privatize everything that is a public resource. You know, whether it's they want to when they want to build infrastructure, they want it to be owned. They want the highways to be owned, et cetera. That's when they talk infrastructure, they don't mean public infrastructure.
If you're just joining us, this is Climate One from the Commonwealth Club. I'm Greg Dalton, and our guests are Robert Rosenthal from the Center for Investigative Reporting and George Lakoff, the cognitive linguist from the University of California at Berkeley. George Lakoff, I want to hear your thoughts on framing as it relates to energy and climate change. People on the right talk about energy independence. People on the left talk about save the planet. So let's get your take on that, as well as climate denial and skepticism, which is something very powerful in ascendance in Washington right now.
Well, first of all, climate deniers don't come along and say, I'm going to deny climate, or I'm going to deny science. They don't do that at all. What happens is that if they have a worldview which doesn't allow that in, so a strict father worldview will have corporations, who are employers above other people. And that means they can do what they want. They're moral in that hierarchy. And therefore, they can do all sorts of things against the environment because that's okay. And so that idea of they're doing things that are bad for the environment and for the planet doesn't enter. It can't be there. Now, a whole lot of people who are progressives and Democrats have another form of denial and of science denial. But they don't recognize it. It has to do with the way they reason. There's a view of reason that goes back to Descartes in 1650. It says that thought is logic. Descartes was a logician. He said, things go by, it's logic. That all thought is conscious. We now know it's 98% unconscious. Thought isn't logic. It has to do with framing, metaphors, and other kinds of mental structures. And what happens is there are a lot of people who accept that. And if you believe that everybody has the same notion of thought and that it's logic, it will follow that if you just tell people the facts, they'll all reason to the right conclusion. Now, we know that keeps being false. And, it's not that facts don't matter, they do matter. But what's happening is people who believe that have a false view of reason, which is denying neuroscience and cognitive science. They're science deniers of a different kind. And it's very important to see that a lot of people, who are very intelligent in the Democratic Party, who are in their pollsters, their strategists, et cetera, and their policy folks, have this view. And it's a form of science denial about their own minds. And that is what happened. Why was it that all the polls were wrong? They were wrong because they only looked at demography. They looked at, things that you could find out about in the census, where you, what religion are you, what's your income, what's your gender, et cetera, but not about your values. That's not part of the poll, and it needs to be.
We're going to go to our lightning round at Climate One with George Lakoff and Robert Rosenthal. Yes or no question. First for George Lakoff. I know this is hard for professors. True or false, George Lakoff, in the last 50 years, Americans have become more tolerant of people with different skin colors and less tolerant of people with different political views.
Sort of.
True or false, Robert Rosenthal, Donald Trump has been good for the business of commercial media.
True.
George Lakoff, Republicans are more disciplined and more skilled at messaging than Democrats.
Absolutely, and there's a good reason for it.
Robert Rosenthal, in part that's because Democrats are convinced facts, truth, and justice are on their side and they will prevail.
That's mushy. True, I guess.
Mushy, you can say mushy. George Lakoff, yes or no, a conservative brain is wired differently than a liberal brain.
Yes.
Robert Rosenthal, fake news has always been here and is here to stay.
True.
George Lakoff, Democrats and Republicans are equally guilty of creating our nation's deep partisan divide.
Excuse me. I think that's true.
Robert Rosenthal, many conservative Americans may not trust your news organization, which is based near Berkeley and run by two veterans of the Philadelphia Choir and the San Francisco Chronicle.
No.
George Lakoff, the Affordable Care Act was poorly named because while it expanded health care insurance for 20 million Americans, it did not reduce costs.
False.
This is an association question where I'll mention a noun.
There was another reason why it was badly named.
I'll mention something, and you tell me either the first thing that comes into your mind, or George Lakoff, you can mention a counter frame. So George Lakoff, tax relief.
Investment.
Robert Rosenthal, death panels.
Life.
George Lakoff, death tax.
Millionaires.
Robert Rosenthal, the other nonprofit news organization, ProPublica.
Good.
George Lakoff, climate change.
Invented by conservatives. It was invented by Frank Luntz, who didn't want global warming. That sounded like people were responsible.
You let students do this in your classroom when you ask for one word?
I never do that. I would never ask students for one word.
I don't think
I
students
ask
ever
them to think.
I don't know if students ever get a word in his class.
Oh, no. The whole point is to get them to talk.
Last one, lightning round. Robert Rosenthal, Kellyanne Conway.
Oy.
Let's end it there. Our thanks for the lightning round. George Lakoff, you did a taxonomy of Donald Trump's tweets that included the preemptive framing, hacking the DNC was the DNC's fault, a trial balloon, we should expand our nuclear arsenal, as well as deflection and diversion. So explain quickly the taxonomy, the predictable taxonomy of his tweets.
Every tweet is strategic, and he knows exactly what he's doing in every single tweet.
So you don't buy this impulsive 3 a.m., I'm just going to pissed off and do something? You don't buy that?
Nonsense. Okay. It's all strategic. There are 4 types. One, he's trying to put out a frame first so he gets to frame it before anybody else does. Like, for example, he actually won the popular vote because there are 3 to 5 million illegals voting, right? That's, a preemptive frame. There is a trial balloon about everybody should have nuclear weapons. Let's see what happens, And, for a day it was sort of out there in the news and then forgotten, right? So, yeah, he can keep on saying that. There are trial balloons. Diversions all the time. Yes, the question arose about the emoluments clause and whether he should be, thrown out of office because of it or prosecuted because of it. And so what does he do? He talks about Meryl Streep. And then the media, like dogs following a ball, they say, for 3 days we're going to show Meryl Streep and have debates about whether celebrities should be able to talk about politics, and on and on. And he always can throw a diversion, almost everything he does. In fact, most of the most outrageous things he does is to divert you from noticing what Paul Ryan Trump is doing.
Robert Rosenthal, what about that? Media's taken the bait. They're following the distraction sideshow from what's really going on.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, it's speed. If you think about 20 years ago, if there was no internet and you basically had, 25 years ago, your newspaper, 3 networks, you had CNN, where he's taken advantage of the speed and his ability, as I said earlier, to be the world's largest and most paid attention to publisher. And I agree with George. A lot of that is diversion, it's distraction, it's trial balloons, and we're dealing with a fire hose constantly. And you need to take time and really, I think, to consume information now, you really have to go to multiple sources, and I think it's really important also to go to sources you are going to be appalled by in terms of how they're telling a story. And it's not just the stories they're telling, it's also what's not being reported to the other side or from your point of view. So it's the selectivity of the information they're pushing to their audience, which they know is coming to them. But I think Twitter, his use of Twitter, I think is brilliant, really. He's mastered it the same way past dictators mastered other mass media. And if you think about radio, which, what the Germans did, what Hitler did, really, it was radio.
Mark Zuckerberg recently published a manifesto. Facebook is becoming a huge media organization, nearly 2 billion monthly users. What does that mean for journalism, Robert Rosenthal, that this huge organization with no journalists is now the biggest media enterprise?
Well, again, I talked about earlier, difference between media and journalism. They are obviously a distribution platform. They connect communities who can do great things, and also communities that can do horrible things, that can now connect instantly, globally. And I think obviously it's been part of the breaking up of the business model of what corporate media or legacy media had. And so new models to sustain what I would call quality information, quality journalism are going to have to be found. And, we're one example of that as a nonprofit. But I also think that, and it's not just Facebook, but some of the people who have made incredible fortunes off of this information technology are going to really have to think about where they're going to invest their money to sustain what I go back to saying, what American standards are and what the media or what journalism meant in our society.
We did a poll on Twitter, and we asked followers on Twitter, why did you vote for your candidate? 39% said I was persuaded by facts. 29% said the other person was a liar. 13% said an issue. And 19% said I voted for my party. So there's tribe, there's facts, there's villainization. George Lakoff, your take on those responses?
Well, first, they thought when you repeat crooked Hillary over and over again, and it's actually 20 years of repetition of that by Republicans, what happens is it gets into people's brains. I mean, it's heard over and over again, and it doesn't matter. You get to start. Your brain takes it in; it becomes true, because it's said repeatedly, and a refrain that's repeated is taken in unless you are constantly vigilant against it. And people generally can't be constantly vigilant against it. So yeah, they thought that Hillary was a liar, when in fact she mostly wasn't. Now, politicians occasionally lie here and there, and you're going to get just about any politician will do that, but that's different from being a systematic liar on major issues.
Robert Rosenthal, Jon Stewart changed the news business by having a fake news show. Tell us about the power of humor. And news is so depressing that people are increasingly looking to humor, and how we'll get to George Lakoff and how that's challenging to oppose.
Well, I think, it's like taking medicine, and if it tastes better, you might swallow it. I think humor is crucial. I mean, satire's always had a huge role in societies, and I think it's important to try and today use different forms of storytelling and take advantage not only of the technology, but the fact that people are so isolated when they consume most of their information, to get them together. One of the things we do is we actually do plays based on some of our deeply reported investigative stories. So I think humor is crucial, and obviously it's easy to consume, and a lot of people got their information from Jon Stewart or Colbert now, and it's a form of humor that's very biting, and also from the right, you have the same type of thing. I mean, some people, I don't think Alex Jones considers himself a humorist, but some people watching him might be appalled, but also really consumed by that. And I think one of the things, again, is this constant messaging, that the refrain, and when people who are not journalists perceived that. Sean Hannity last night, I watched him when he went to the CPAC meeting, he was basically, sounded exactly like Donald Trump, his message to that. So he's a zephyr in a sense for that. And again, the people are confused. They don't know when they watch something. They think it's factual information. Even so, opinion and fact are completely blurred, and point of view really trumps everything. No pun intended.
Robert Rosenthal is Executive Director of the Center for Investigative Reporting. I'm Greg Dalton. This is Climate One from the Commonwealth Club. And our other guest is George Lakoff, the cognitive linguist from the University of California at Berkeley. George Lakoff, I'd like to hear your thought on humor, because it's spontaneous, it's not voluntary, and it's particularly threatening to someone who's interested in authoritarian control, because it's true and it's spontaneous.
Right, because if you have authoritarian control, humor is based on embarrassment. Definitely always based on, why do you laugh when you're embarrassed, right? It's based on embarrassment, and the idea of a strict father control is not to be embarrassed, ever. because you're supposed to be totally in control. Now, by the way, I think somebody like Andy Borowitz, who gives obviously fake news,
New Yorker writer.
If you don't know Andy Borowitz, go to the Borowitz Report instantly. What he does is tell the truth by giving a fake story. And it's a deep truth, truth using all the kinds of mental tropes that you have, metaphors and frames and so on, but beautifully done, artistically done, virtually every day.
And why do you say that Donald Trump should be called the minority president, and that should be repeated? What's your thinking there?
Because that takes away his authority.
And legitimacy.
And legitimacy. It takes away, and it reminds him over and over, as long as it's said, that he's not legitimate.
Empathy is something we haven't talked about. Van Jones, after the election, did something really interesting. He went in this Messy Truth series. He went to, this is a liberal Democrat, went into people's living rooms in middle America and talked to people he hadn't talked to, and he had empathy for people who, are very different than him. So, Robert Rosenthal, I'd like to ask you about, the role of empathy and kind of empathizing with we have this elitist coastal media in the role of empathy.
Well, I think empathy is a crucial, if you want to call it, tool of the best storytelling, the best journalism. The best journalists will take you to people you don't know, you don't understand, and hopefully make you understand their world. And empathy, again, is a crucial. I bet everybody in this room, unless you're Native American, your ancestors came from another country. A lot of them face tremendous adversity, racism, you name it. And should we have empathy based on our heritage? Well, I think empathy is being sort of thrown out of the block. And in this divided world we're in the divided United States, I think that, again, is one of the biggest threats. There is very little empathy. And I think the best journalism really needs to give voice to divided communities so you can really begin to hear and understand. I think the values question we're talking about, there are a lot of values we share. There are other things we're not going to share, but those values have to be understood so you can understand where someone is coming from. And I think that was the biggest flaw of the election, where you have the following of the campaign, but very little actually going out into the middle part of the country and really talking and listening to people. We did a piece really early on where we went and spoke to Trump supporters all around the country. And there was this one, and when I heard this, I thought, this is why Trump's going to win. And this was last February, where we talked to a guy in Nevada. He described himself as a loser. And he had just lost his job, and he was back, he said, living with his mother in a trailer, sleeping in the same bed I slept in 25 years ago. We asked him why he liked Trump, and there's this long pause, and he goes, he makes me feel good. When I heard that, I said, whoa. And then we said, who are you going to vote for if you don't vote for Trump? He said, Bernie, because he'll legalize pot. Because that made him feel good, too.
George Lakoff, another emotion before we go to audience questions, fear. Fear has been very effective after 9/11. We heard Saddam Hussein, et cetera, at 9/11. We're now very fearful of ISIL or terrorist attack, even though we have a greater chance of being killed by lightning or other things. And yet fear for climate change doesn't seem to be motivating. Why are we're so afraid of a terrorist attack, but we're not afraid of climate change?
All right, first of all, climate change was brought in by Frank Luntz in order to, for the right, because it sounded nice. Climate is like palm trees, and you think of nice climates, and change just happens. It's not a personal thing. That's why the idea was then. And then the idiots who were looking at global warming accepted the right-wing view. I mean, unbelievable. Now, think for a minute about what it is in your bodies that has to do with understanding, whether it's climate change or global warming or whatever, that takes you to an understanding of the planet. Why do people like to go on vacations to the ocean, to the mountains, to beautiful places? Why? Because of the fact that they connect with nature. You are built to connect with nature. Why do you see the polar bear on the ice floe and you immediately connect with the polar bear on the ice floe? Why do you see these things in nature? Imagine all the possibilities of all the beautiful things that you've ever experienced in nature being taken away from you. Try to imagine that. Just to get you to understand nature in your body, it's there. We are built to function in nature. We're biologically built. I go through it if you want, but you probably don't. but there are things in your brain that connect you to nature. There are things in your body that connect you to nature. And we don't talk about that. We talk about something distant, as if it is, the planet is something viewed from outer space, not from in your body. I mean, this is an embodied issue. And it's an issue that is in your children's bodies.
How should people concerned about climate change talk about it? We're going to change the name of Climate One, I guess. But other than that, how should people talk about it?
Well, first of all, there are many ways to talk about it. But first, I think, begin with the way you connect with nature and why it is incredibly valuable to you. For any time you want to get a sense of awe or beauty in the world, you go to where do you go? You go to the ocean, you go to beautiful forests, you go to places that are lovely, that make you just feel wonderful when you're in them, okay? Why is that? Because we are built to connect with nature. We are part of nature, and nature nurtures us. Nature cares for us. We are nurtured by nature all over the place. Just think of all the ways in which we are nurtured by nature, in which we are taken care of by nature, and we owe it. There's a debt to those who nurture us.
We're going to go to audience questions and invite you to join us in the conversation. We have about 15 minutes left. There's a microphone over there, and invite you to go there now. And please briefly introduce yourself. Brief comment or question. I'm here to help you keep it brief if you need that help. And we'll get through as many as we can in the time we have left. If we can go there now, and our apologies if we don't get through the line. This is Climate One from the Commonwealth Club, and we're talking about language and politics with George Lakoff, linguist from UC Berkeley, and Robert Rosenthal, executive director of the Center for Investigative Reporting. I'm Greg Dalton. Welcome to Climate One. Let's go to our next question. First question. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. My name is Kristen Lynn. I actually work at Berkeley. But I was wondering if you could both speak to whether you think there's any tension between empathy and at least our perception of fact, and how we should think about navigating that both in terms of consuming media and in our interpersonal relationships with each other.
Robert Rosenthal, tension between empathy and facts?
I think that, there is a tension. I think, again, we're in this moment where, depending on the source of the information, the spin on what you should be empathetic for, it can be completely distorted and come from a different point of view. Here's an example. Hate crimes are being reported, increasing, et cetera, and there might be a story about a victim of a hate crime. Breitbart News, if you follow it, does not report hate crimes happening. What they report on is any hate crime that is debunked. So that is not going to create empathy. It might create empathy for the policemen or the investigators who debunked it. So you're taking the same set, something's happening, but you're telling the story or reporting it from completely different points of view. And I think that the use of empathy in storytelling, a victim of who's been shot or harmed in an attack in this country, you will feel empathy for, and that will be used one way. How much empathy do we have in our news reporting of a place where American drones or airstrikes have killed 40 people? We don't know about those people, so there's very little empathy. They're the other. So again, I think this is really central part of the information gathering and how it's disseminated.
Let's go to our next question. Welcome.
Wait, can I respond to that?
Sure.
On empathy? Look, there's several forms of empathy, one of which is, in order for me to describe conservatives, I have to put myself in their shoes. There's a form of empathy of understanding someone else who is very different from you, has different values from you, but you need to understand. Understanding is one form of empathy. There are other forms of empathy as well, not just feeling bad for someone, but shifting a point of view. Take the word regulation. The word regulation is from the point of view of corporations. If you go look online with regulations, it's all stuff that the corporations have put there. And what does it mean for a corporation? It means there's government overreach that has taken away its freedom, that has burdened it, and that is costly. So we need to get rid of regulations. Why are regulations there? They're there to protect the public. Every regulation is a protection. If you shift the viewpoint from the corporations, who can do whatever they want to harm people, to the people who are harmed, to the public, that shift of view changes things. And it's the empathy for the public rather than for the corporations that is involved here. So what I recommend in each case is look at the viewpoint from which the framing takes place and shift the viewpoint to the public.
Let's go to our next question. Welcome to Climate One.
Hi, my name is Daniela, local climate organizer, and I have some framing questions about climate change. So you spoke about climate change very much in a nurturant framing term when you talked about connection to nature. Do you think that would be an effective message for people with a strict father conservative morality, and or just simply many people in this country who don't have access to that connection to nature that many of us in this room may experience? And also, I was wondering whether you think that it would be effective to rebrand people who speak about climate science with an accepting point of view, but don't take any bold action on it, to rebrand them as climate deniers, since they know the facts but don't take action.
We call that climate denial light, people who drive a Prius but aren't doing as much about it as they, as they could. George Lakoff, briefly.
That's a lot of questions.
Right. So pick one.
Well, it's hard to know which one to pick because they're all so good. What are they again? Repeat those.
Number one is nature and climate change. Is that connection too nurturant? Number two, should we be calling people who don't take bold action climate deniers?
Not that they're deniers. They are people who, don't have the courage of their convictions. I mean, period. And there aren't nice. There's not a nice single word for that. But it's not having the courage of your convictions. If you have convictions, you should be acting on them. That's what they're about. They're not just things you say, oh, I have this conviction, and oh, okay, I'll sit around and I'll have another conviction. I mean, if you really have a calling, to have a conviction, it has to be in your heart, in your body, and you can't not act on it. That's what it means. And it's not just courage. It is just the will, the idea that your body requires you to act on it. If your conviction is embodied, if it's in you, you act.
I talked yesterday with a person very concerned about climate change who said they're going to get a new car. I was like, oh, you're going to get an electric car? No, I'm going to buy a Jaguar. Oh, guess you're not so concerned. Let's go to the next audience question.
Hi, my name is Andy Raskin. I work on messaging, but with CEOs and leadership teams in Silicon Valley. And I was curious, Professor Lakoff, you mentioned that you felt that conservatives were inherently better at messaging, and you said you'd get to that. We didn't get to it. I'm curious to hear why.
Very good reason for it. If you're a conservative, you go to college, what do you study? Probably some business courses. In that curriculum, there's a course called marketing. What do marketing professors study? My field, cognitive science. That is, they study the way that people really think in terms of frames, metaphors, images, narratives, and emotions, right? That's what's in marketing and in repetition. The way, how repetition works in advertising. You repeat, 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 right? That is the way they're taught, and they learn it. It's second nature that they get to market their ideas. If you are a progressive, you go to college, you're interested in politics, what do you study? Political science, law, public policy, economic theory, right? Those fields have a different view of reason. It's a view of reason from Descartes in 1650 that says all thought is logic, It's all conscious, and it's all it's traditional rationality defined in terms of Cartesian reasoning from 1650. It denies the fact that thought is 98% unconscious, that it's physical, that it's in your brain, that you need to know something about neuroscience to understand it, and so on. In short, what happens is my institutions, the universities, are miseducating progressives.
So don't go to college. Let's have our next question.
Hi, my name is Sarah Kamens. I work in clean energy policy. I've been a fan of yours, Professor Lakoff, since I went to graduate school at Berkeley many years ago.
Yes.
I have a similar question to
you.
some other people, but it seems like it's a topic that people are really interested in. It's about framing global warming. I've noticed a lot of progressive use conservative frames saying, I believe in climate change, or climate change is real, and that really frustrates me. Or they repeat Trump's climate change is a hoax, perpetuated, blah, blah. You all know that phrase. My question is, how can we do a better job at making a distinction between our position and conservatives' position without using their frames of believing in something is real?
Well, when you just say, oh, it's real, it raises the question about whether it's real, right? And so you have to presuppose that it's real. You have to have a discourse where it's obviously real and you go on. And then we can ask what kinds of discourses they are. There are many of them. One of the major problems in framing of all of this stuff comes from climate scientists. Let me give you an example. I first realized this back in 2005. I was at the Aspen Institute. They had a climate scientist there, a very distinguished guy, gave a great talk. And afterwards, he was asked, was Hurricane Katrina caused by global warming? And he said, oh, no, we can't possibly say that any particular hurricane is caused by any particular, by global warming or anything like that, Wrong answer. Because it doesn't distinguish between direct causation, which is I pick this up and I take a drink right now, here, and I know I'm going to do it because I can do it, and here it is, right? Direct causation. Now, systemic causation is what happens in the real world, because an ecological system is a system. Why is it, think about what goes on. We studied this in Energy and Resources at Berkeley, in a class I co-taught with Dan Kamen. And what we found was that there were 4 types of systemic causation and mixtures of them. There were sequences of causes. Example, you get global warming over the.
We got 2 minutes left.
All right, you better go. But systemic causation is
systemic
important,
causation.
and you need to take account of it. And scientists are not trained. They know perfectly well about systemic causation, but they think that the word cause only means direct causation. And they need to be able to talk about how the ecological system gives rise to the causes.
You can tell his brain works like a syllabus, right? Let's go to our next audience question.
Hi, my name's Chris. I run a software company that helps organizations reduce their carbon, wastewater, toxic emissions. And I'm not sure who this question is for, but it seems like my whole life the world has been divided between left and right. And we've been talking a lot about language and what Trump says and doesn't say. I used to think McCain was, not my guy, but now he looks reasonable. And
no,
more so.
And so your
but
question
there seems
is?
like my question is that there seems to be something deeper going on in the country and in the framing of politics. And I'm wondering if someone could be more succinct about what that is besides just my fear.
Well, that's what this strict father, nurturing parent distinction is about. It's about whether, if you have a nurturing parent view of raising children, you're going to apply it to politics in such a way that you believe in caring about other citizens and getting public resources for that. What's happening right now is that the right-wing Republicans are trying to privatize all public resources, to take all of that away and make profit out of it. That is part of a strict father view. That view is a big deal. Now, of course, most people are partly one and partly the other. They are moderates. What is a moderate? Someone who is partly, who is major, has one major view and a minor view, and they're in different things. And I think that's important to understand what the minor view is. The name for that, is, well, let's just call it a minor view. That is, you have two different views in your brain. You have both worldviews, and how can a single brain get both worldviews? It's called mutual inhibition. The activation of one turns off the other. And if you can appeal to the progressive worldview, that is the nurturant worldview in conservatives, and many conservatives have nurturant worldviews, you do that. If it's someone you know very well, it's easier. I tell my students who say, Christmas is coming, I'm going to see my grandfather again, we're going to have this big fight, it's going to be horrible. And I say, don't fight with your grandfather. Ask him a question. What are you most proud of that you did to help other people? And they all come back and they say, well, my grandfather did 3 good things, And I say, keep talking to him about those good things.
Let's go to our last question for George Lakoff and Robert Rosenthal at Climate One.
Hello, my name's Bobby, and I'm retired. Several months ago, this is for George Lakoff. Several months ago, I heard you interviewed on the radio, and I caught just the tail end of it, but you were discussing the how and why of people who vote against their best interests, especially those people who have the least, or they'll vote for people who represent not their best interests. And would you please speak to that?
Right. If you have a strict father view in your family, what does that mean? It means in your domain, you want to be the authority, the person who's in charge, who has respect for that and absolute respect. And there are millions and millions of people like that who are not wealthy, but they want that respect. They want that view in their domain, whatever it is, and it defines who they are personally, right? That they vote against their interest because they're voting for their very identity. They're voting for who they are. To vote against that just for material things is, it would be terrible. Now, the Democratic Party seems to not understand this at all, and they think that the propagandist view that the people who voted for Trump were populists. And they think, oh, that means populists, want more stuff for themselves, and all we have to do is give more stuff to the right-wing populists, we can turn them to left-wing populists. No, because they're not populists. They have strict father morality, which goes directly against nurturant morality, which is the basis of progressive thought, right? The party doesn't understand that. And all of these views that say, oh, if we can just raise their wages, get them better health care, et cetera, they'll vote for us. Sorry.
As we wrap up, we've been talking, this is Climate One. We haven't talked a whole lot about climate change, but Robert Rosenthal, is climate change getting the kind of coverage that you think it deserves in the mainstream news media?
No. It's been usurped. I mean, we talked earlier by the fire hose that's coming out of Washington right now, and I think it will take really big disasters. And I think one of the challenges, how do people, besides feeling hot or watching the tides rise, how does it really affect them? And we could go on and talk about that versus the fear of a terrorist. And I think one of the challenges again is to create empathy for the things that will be engendered from climate change or the changing environment we're in and the risks we all face for that. And it's the future. We're in a moment now. The moment is fixating all of us.
Right. Climate change seems far away in time and space, even though we have lots of examples of it. George Lakoff.
Take disasters, right? We don't talk about global warming floods. We don't talk about global warming droughts. We don't talk about global warming fires. We don't talk about global warming hurricanes, tornadoes, et cetera, that are systemically caused by global warming. We need to be able to say, okay, here are the causes. We should have a little app that tells you in cartoon form what the sequence of causes is for every weatherman for free, right? Because until you say, this is a global warming hurricane, you are flooded out of this because of the use of gas and oil and coal, right? Until you say things like that in public over and over again, you're not going to get it.
Good suggestion for the journalists who are in the audience today. If you're just joining us, we're talking about climate change and language and politics with George Lakoff, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and Robert Rosenthal, who is the executive director of the Center for Investigative Reporting. We're going to end here with, we've been talking about fake news, propaganda, alternative facts, and journalism in a divided America. You can hear a podcast of this and other Climate One programs wherever you podcast and watch videos about energy, food, water, clean energy, and global warming events at climateone.org. To end, we will hear from one other expert on the truth.
My name is Edith Ann, and that's the truth.
All right, that's Lily Tomlin, for those of you who remember. Rowan and Martin laughing, perhaps knows a little bit more truth. Thank you all for coming here at Climate One in San Francisco. Let's thank our guests again. Thank you.